There's a generation that raised itself, that worked harder than any generation before it, that survived recessions, layoffs, and complete cultural erasure. And almost nobody talks about them. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, this video is about you, and about why the world decided you didn't exist. Every generation has a story. Boomers rebuilt a nation after World War II. Millennials were called the most anxious, the most indebted, the most talked about. Gen Z became the focus of every conversation about the future. And Generation X? Generation X got a letter. Just the letter X. The unknown variable. The generation without a name, without a narrative, without a movement. Researchers at the University of Michigan identified something remarkable. Generation X receives less media coverage, less cultural recognition, and less political attention than any other living generation. Not because they're smaller, not because they're less significant, but because of something that happened during the most critical window of their development. And that something is still shaping who they are today. Let's go deep into that. Let's start with what shaped Gen X more than anything else. Absence. Between 1965 and 1980, the American family was going through its biggest transformation in history. Divorce rates doubled. Mothers entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The concept of the latchkey kid was born. Children who came home from school, unlocked the door themselves, and waited hours for a parent to arrive. 40% of Gen X children grew up in single-parent homes at some point. That number was unheard of for any previous generation, and developmental psychologists have spent decades studying what that means. Children who experience chronic parental absence, even when that absence is caused by necessity, not neglect, develop what researchers call a hyper-independence adaptation. They learn to solve problems alone. They learn not to ask for help. They learn that the only person they can fully count on is themselves. Sound familiar? If you're Gen X, you probably don't even recognize this as a trauma response. You call it being self-sufficient. You call it not being a burden. You call it just the way things are. But neuroscience calls it something else. It calls it an early wired survival circuit, one that got activated before you were 10 years old, and one that's still running in the background of every relationship and every decision you make today. Now let's talk about what Gen X saw on television. Because television in the 70s and 80s wasn't just entertainment. It was the primary caregiver for millions of Gen X children who spent hours alone at home. And what it taught them was contradictory in a way no previous generation had experienced. On one side, the American dream in full color. Dynasty, Dallas, perfect families with perfect houses and perfect futures. On the other side, the news, Watergate, the Iran hostage crisis, nuclear war drills in school, the AIDS epidemic with no answers. Gen X was the first generation to grow up with real-time access to a world falling apart. Psychologists call this narrative dissonance. When the cultural story you're told about how life should be directly contradicts the reality you see every day. The result is a generation that learned to be deeply skeptical, not cynical for the sake of being cool. Genuinely, neurologically skeptical. Because they were conditioned from childhood to distrust the official story. Studies show Gen X adults score higher on critical thinking assessments than both boomers and millennials. They're also significantly less likely to trust institutions, authority figures, and large corporations. This isn't pessimism. This is a generation that learned, before they could vote, that the people in charge are often wrong. And they never forgot that lesson. Here's the part that cuts the deepest. Generation X didn't just get ignored by the media, they got skipped. Literally. When the conversation about generational identity started in the 1990s, marketing agencies, Media companies and cultural observers made a decision. Boomers were too large and too powerful to ignore, and the generation coming after Gen X, the Millennials, were already being born in massive numbers. So the cultural spotlight jumped from the greatest generation to boomers, from boomers directly to millennials. Gen X was in the middle of both conversations. Large enough to matter, small enough to skip. There's a psychological concept called generational invisibility. It describes what happens to a cohort of people when the cultural narrative simply doesn't include them. When no one writes movies about their teenage years, when no one studies their economic struggles, when no politician targets their specific needs, when they become the most overlooked group in every demographic study. The impact isn't just professional, it's deeply personal. Human beings are social creatures. We need to see ourselves reflected in the world around us. We need to feel that our struggles are recognized, that our story is worth telling. When a generation doesn't get that reflection, something subtle but powerful happens inside them. They internalize the invisibility. They start to believe, without anyone ever saying it directly, that what they went through wasn't important enough to talk about, that their pain didn't count, that they should just handle it and move on. And Gen X became the most move-on generation in history, not because they healed, but because they were never given space to do anything else. But here's what the data actually shows. Generation X is the most economically resilient generation alive today. They entered the workforce during a recession. They hit their peak earning years right before 2008. They rebuilt. They entered their 50s facing another economic disruption. And they adapted. Again. Psychologists at Stanford published research showing that adults who developed hyper-independence in childhood often become the most adaptive problem solvers in adulthood. Not because the early experiences were good, but because those experiences created a nervous system that knows how to function under pressure. Gen X has higher rates of entrepreneurship than boomers or millennials. They have lower rates of burnout-related hospitalization than millennials. They score higher on workplace adaptability assessments. They are, statistically, the generation best equipped to handle a world that keeps changing the rules. And they got here the hard way, without a safety net, without the cultural support that other generations received, without anyone stopping to say, what happened to you matters. What you survived was real. What you built from that is extraordinary. If you're Gen X, I need you to hear something directly. The fact that your story wasn't told doesn't mean it wasn't worth telling. The fact that you learned to need no one doesn't mean needing people is weak. The fact that you moved on doesn't mean you fully processed what you moved on from. Psychologists call the moment when someone finally sees the pattern behind their behavior an insight release. It's the point where the automatic response, handle it alone, don't ask for help, just keep going, gets replaced by something more conscious, something more compassionate, toward yourself. You were shaped by a world that asked too much of you too early. You responded by becoming someone who could handle anything. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most remarkable acts of resilience any generation has ever performed. And it deserves to be seen. If this video described someone you know, or someone you are, share it with them. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for a Gen X person in your life is simply say, I see you. Next video, we go deep into the Millennials, the generation that was told they were special and grew up feeling like the most let-down generation in history. See you there.